Hello, I am Terry Johnsson. I am from Portland, Oregon, and I'm part of Portland Adventist Medical Center, and I'm here at Castle to be part of the Week of Spiritual Emphasis. Well, what I want to share with you is a message of hope and that God has a plan for all of our lives. One of the verses that stands out to me, and a verse that was used for my life, was taken from the book of Mark, chapter 10, verse 27. And the story pretty much lets us know that with God, all things are possible. And I truly believe that the messages that I'll be sharing throughout this week will remind you that God does have a plan for our life. And if you're in a situation that seems impossible, that seems like I don't know how I'm there and how it's going to work out, that I just hope that my life and the stories that I'm going to share with you, stories about aiming high, stories about your own plan for your life. And I've said this so often that if you have breath, if you have air in your lungs, that shows that God's not through with you yet and that He does have a plan for your life. Now, a lot of times people will look at me and they will say, well, that's easy for you to say, that you are, you have a doctorate degree and you have all this stuff, you've worked for presidents, but you don't understand what I'm going through. And that's why I like to share with people that we never can judge people by what we see on the outside, because we all have our own individual stories. And our stories are our own personal stories. And what I have discovered is that God can use our story and that He can make something unique and something fantastic out of it. Now, I started off in a very unique situation that I struggled in school, that I attended a very large public elementary school in the second grade. In fact, it was so large that we had one teacher for 57 students. And they didn't know exactly what to do. The poor teacher, she just did the best that she could do, try to put people where and all the different things. And she was just literally overwhelmed. And so she ended up placing me in the very back of the classroom. And there she gave me a coloring book. And I remember just thinking that I was so special. I didn't have to do schoolwork. All I had to do was color. Until one day something happened that forever changed my life. And that is when another teacher walked in and she saw me in the very back of the room. And she simply said, "This isn't making sense. Why is he back there?" And her not realizing that I could overhear the whole conversation, the teacher basically said, "Well, he's a little mentally retarded." And that was the word they used back then. And that he just can't learn. And I remember hearing those words and just thinking, what does that mean? And went a step farther and I started asking people. When they told me what it meant to be mentally retarded, I remember that my whole life completely changed. In fact, I can still hear the teacher saying those words to this day. And from that moment on, I wouldn't even color anymore. I would just take the coloring book and they would give it to me. I would rip it. I would give me crayons. I would throw them. And that was it. And so the school system had me see a psychologist. And the psychologist went through the whole everything. And to make a long story short, the psychologist basically said, yeah, I agree, that this kid this cannot learn, no matter what. And I like to share with people that I had something that made a difference in my life, and I like to call it my secret weapon. And the secret weapon was basically I had a mother that believed that God still did miracles. I had a mother that believed that no matter how impossible situations might seem, that God can touch those situations and He can make good out of those situations. And so Mother started praying for me that summer. And in fact, that should have been the end of Terry Johnsson right there, but no, she kept on praying. Mom made a list of over 110 different elementary schools. She wrote on that list all these schools, and she was going to have me go, move, whatever it would take to get me back into a normal school system. And it just, nothing came together. And we still actually have that list to this day. And that list has a line drawn through every single school. And there are times where I feel bad. I go back and I look at that list and I think, God was able to take my situation and do something out of it, because, once again, that should have been the end of Terry Johnson's story. Well, finally, Mom found a little Christian school that at least would talk to her, a little private school. They probably only had 50 kids in the whole school. And the principal met with my mom, and as they met, they talked, and the principal finally just said, you know what, I could never take that much time for one student. We could never even afford to do that. And the principal said, at least let me pray for you. And so they did something unique. They got on their knees and they prayed for me and that God would do something. And my mom was just so thankful that this guy at least took time to pray. Well, there was a teacher who was walking in to ask the principal a question, and she ended up hearing the whole conversation. So when my mom left, she simply asked the principal, what grade would the little fella be in? And the principal said, well, I guess he would have to take the entire second grade all over again. And maybe even first grade if you didn't know anything. She said, well, that's my class. And so that teacher accepted me in her classroom. And she made a deal with the principal that they would work with me for 6 months. And if they couldn't get me to learn to read in 6 months, that would be it. And she said, well, at least I would know in our heart that we tried. And I like to tell people that she was probably one of the toughest ladies that I've known. And it was so funny because what she would do is that she would give the rest of the kids their assignment, then she would go to her desk, she would come back with a Bible, sit the Bible on the desk, pull up a chair and say, we're going to work on your reading. And so often I would say, I can't, that's impossible. And if you've ever known Mrs. Sherlock or if you've had someone like her, she was one of those strong ladies of faith, a strong little Irish lady. And Mrs. Sherlock would say, well, you're never going to say those words in my classroom. And she eventually ended up getting a ruler. And that she would just say, no, you're not going to do that in my classroom. You're going to think possible. And then once again, that verse that my mom would share, Mrs. Sherlock would say, God, all things are possible. And so she just kept working with me. And all I can tell you is at the end of 6 months, to everyone's amazement, I was reading for the first time in my life. And I know in my heart that it wasn't for those two special people that God brought in my life, Mrs. Sherlock and my mother, that my life would have been completely different. When I was chosen to be part of the President's Honor Guard at the White House, I had to take this fancy test called the Presidential Psychological Examination. And anyone who works near the President on a regular basis, they have to go through this. And for the first time, they discovered why I couldn't read. I had dyslexia, the reading disorder. And not only did I have dyslexia, I had one of the worst cases that they had ever seen. And they were just absolutely shocked and amazed. And I remember them asking me all these questions, and they started naming all these fancy formulas. Did they use that technique or that technique? And then one of the professors came up and he said, well, did they give you special glasses, the one that tint one way and they tint? And I said, I've never heard of any of that stuff before. And I said, the only thing I can tell you is that I had a teacher that used the Bible that worked with me every day. And I remember the look on their face, how they were saying, that's just impossible. Well, it happened because they did all the testing on me and they discovered that I hadn't used any of that fancy stuff that they thought of. And the only thing they could trace me learning to read was Mrs. Sherlock in the second grade using the Bible. And so that's why I say, and I'm going to be sharing throughout this entire week, that nothing is impossible with God. Nothing. Maybe you have someone that you've been praying for that this doesn't seem to be going right. You have to hold on to that verse that nothing's impossible with God. Or maybe your own self, you're going through something at work that you're trying to do the best that you can. Is this not coming together? Well, that's the time that we have to depend upon God even more. And finally, maybe even with your own health and your spiritual condition. I don't know what it is, but I just want to challenge you and to say that nothing's impossible with God. And so for the remainder of this week, I'll be sharing with you stories, because I believe that we all have stories, and part of what I want to do is to have you to hear my story, and then you're able to think about something that you're going through, and you'll realize that as you've gone through that most difficult thing in the past, that you weren't by yourself. And even being here in Hawaii, I think of footprints on the sand, of how the person, when they saw only one set, they were just wondering, where was God when I was going through this? And then, as you know, it says that that's when God was closest to them. And that's what I'm hoping to share with you this week through story, that you'll understand that God's closer to you than you think. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to meeting you in person and having you be able to come out to the meetings. God bless you.